Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for coming here today. We're all really excited that you are able to join us for this special Vel Phillips Forum with the Milwaukee Turners and our friends here from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for 21st Century Studies. I'm Emilio Dottore, the Executive Director for the Milwaukee Turners, and in a few minutes we'll be exploring whether or not trust can be scaled in our final Trust and the Vote roundtable discussion. This is a supremely important question to ask ourselves as we head into a very heated season leading up to the big presidential election. And of course, you can always find out more information about your ballot and voting in general at myvote.wi.gov. This is also being streamed on Zoom, will be recorded and edited and shared later. So if you are watching virtually, feel free to ask your questions in the panel, and Connie will curate those questions and make sure that the panelists are asked those questions. There is some technical difficulty with Facebook, so it'll be streamed this way and then edited and then shared on Facebook and YouTube in the future. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Kenan.
Hi, I'm Kevin Ferguson. I'll be moderating today's debate on emotions and the vote. Although I think we'll go quite beyond those two topics to talk about their relationships and the way in which the experience of people in Milwaukee and people in the United States takes those into account. But before we do that, I'd like to introduce a couple of people who are helping make this possible. First, I'd like to introduce Jason Puskar, who is the Associate Dean of the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Thank you. I'm Jason Puskar, Associate Dean for the Humanities here at UWM in the College of Letters and Sciences. And on behalf of UWM's Center for 21st Century Studies, it's my pleasure to welcome our guests, our community partners, and our speakers to this latest roundtable discussion in the Trust and the Vote series, titled today, Can Trust Be Scaled? Scaling Trust and the Emotions of Voting. I'll leave the introductions of our speakers for a moment, but I want to start by thanking C21, which organized this forum, and our partners, the Milwaukee Turners. C21 is celebrating its 55th year of building a community of scholars to address the most pressing issues of our time. I recognize, as I'm sure many of you do, that the humanities must play a crucial role in developing and defending our democratic institutions. So I couldn't be more grateful to C21's leadership in this important conversation. And of course, that conversation must engage our friends and colleagues beyond the humanities too. So we warmly welcome the wide range of perspectives on this distinguished panel today. I think we all know that the emotional temperature couldn't be higher as we head into the fall election season, summer and fall election season. But in moments like this, most of all, we need to hear from thoughtful speakers like these. They can help us step back, gain the insights, regain the context that no democracy can do without. There's almost never a shortage of action in our world today, but it seems to me there's a definite paucity of thought. Too often we lurch instinctively, and too often those instincts are animated mostly by anger. One role of the university is to bring cool heads to the heat of the moment, and I know that's what C21 and Milwaukee Turners are doing today. So special thanks to our speakers for joining us, to our partners, Milwaukee Turners, to Professor Ann Basting and C21 for organizing this event, to Professor Ferguson for facilitating it, and to everyone here for taking the time to think about the feelings of democracy when it's all too tempting to feel that we don't have to bother to think. Welcome all. I'll turn it over to Kenan again. Thank you.
And I'm only here momentarily to introduce Ann Basting, the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies.
Thank you. I just want to add just a few comments and just to reiterate what an incredible partnership. I'm so thankful to the Turners and this massive team. For those on Zoom, you can't see the technological apparatus and it's amazing. I think we're actually streaming this underwater in outer space and in multiple other places at the same time. So thank you, even if Facebook isn't working. It's been my joy to be the director of the Center for 21st Century Studies for the last couple of years, with this general sort of turn toward building the community of scholars to address the pressing issues of our time toward a bit broader audience by asking people what's on the top of heart and mind. And that is where we came up with our themes, Lonely No More, Nourishing Trust, and now Trust and the Vote. And those pieces have multiple parts. The roundtables, this is the second and last one that we're doing, and then also the story cart, which will premiere, and I invite you all to come upstairs after this event. Just push 9 on the elevator, take you right up to the top floor, where you'll get to see the first run, the inaugural run of the story cart for this Trust and the Vote series. There's 2 programs. It's sponsored by the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. We take the cart out to where people live their stories, and we're asking, where are you on the scale between trust and distrust in our civic processes? And you'll get to see that one upstairs today. The second one is the Teach a Kid to Vote Challenge. Can you teach a kid to vote? We collaborated with the UWM Children's Learning Center and the League of Women Voters to illustrate a book on why vote and how to do it. And then we're inviting young adults to see if they can actually teach a 4 or 5-year-old to vote. If they can, they get a sticker that says, I taught a kid to vote. If they can't, they get a sticker that says, a kid taught me to vote, and we hand them the children's illustrated booklet of why and how to vote. So that we're going to take out to various campuses across the city. And then those end up in an archive. We have a whole team on the back end transcribing all of those. It'll be a social media piece. You'll see that. And I imagine we'll partner with the Turners on spreading the word on those joyful storytelling projects as well. I also want to thank both of the speakers who will be introduced shortly, but I also want to point out, and with great gratitude, to the Tommy Thompson Center for Public Leadership, which sponsored Dr. Guderian's visit all the way in from Syracuse, and a nice rainy drive back from O'Hare this morning. Thankfully, it wasn't a snowy drive. So I turn it back over. Again, welcome you all, and up to the center right afterwards, and you can share where you are on the scale between trust and distrust, and why you put yourself there, and where you want to be. And we also have some food up there for you afterwards. So thank you, Kenan, as well, and I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Anne. For those of you who have seen the advertisements for today, I regret to start off by saying that one of the 3 people that was supposed to be attending was unable to. She had a sudden onset of COVID and wasn't even able to show up on our video channel. I will point out that she's the co-author of the book Empty Fields, Empty Promises. Her name is Loka Ashwood, and it's especially for those of you interested in the relationship between a kind of rural farmer attention to the political and the conflicts that can come up between that and an urban focus. It's a really useful book to have. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists in turn in alphabetical order, and I excuse me, want to point out that all 3 of the original participants, but the 2 of them, are coming from the question of community, emotion, engagement from very different ways, but in, I think, using methods and approaches that are going to be interestingly complementary. Our first guest is Shana Guderian. She is an American political scientist, political psychologist, and educator. She's the Merle Goldberg Fabian Professor of Excellence in Citizenship and Critical Thinking, and chair of the Department of Political Science at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Her co-authored book, Anxious Politics, Democratic Citizenship in a Threatening World, received the Robert E. Lane Award for being the best book in political psychology, published in 2015. Her 2022 co-authored book, Pandemic Politics, has been named the best book of 2023 by Foreign Affairs. And each of our participants is going to briefly introduce themselves, their projects, their interests, and then we'll start a discussion. So first to Professor Gadarian.
Great. Well, thanks. Wait till I get a mic. Sorry. I would say in class I have a loud voice, but that doesn't work for our friends on Zoom. So thank you for the kind introduction. So just to start thinking about what are my general interests, what can we, I think what we'll talk about is my work on emotion. More generally, I am interested as a political scientist in how everyday Americans understand and react to a world that they think of as chaotic and frightening. How I'm interested in how people practice democratic citizenship and the way that threats can undermine or enhance their democratic competence. I think we often think of emotion as undercutting rationality and undercutting the way that people can interact fully in democracy. But my work on emotion, and we can talk more about the specific type of studies that my co-author and I have done in this area, show that emotion is a tool. It's something that's natural. It is developed over time to help us connect to each other, connect to the political world, and it is not on its own a bad thing. It provides us ways to engage in politics in a world where many people find engagement challenging, frightening, or uninteresting. And so emotion is one potential way that we can get people interested in politics. Now, how does that interest manifest itself? Well, I wrote a whole book on anxiety. The book focuses on 4 policy areas: immigration, public health, climate change, and terrorism. And my co-author and I are interested in when people are frightened about those topics, what kind of information do they seek out, who do they trust, and what kind of attitudes do they have in terms of what they want government to do to protect them. And I'll just give you like quick highlights. So anxiety, it turns out, makes people pay more attention to politics. So if I'm scared about something, I want to find out what's going on, I gather more information. Normatively, we might think that's a good thing. But if any of you have ever had a headache and went on Google to figure out, like, could this headache be a brain tumor? You know that there are other implications for what that information searching might be like, which is that under conditions of anxiety, it is true that people seek out more information, but they are also more attentive to that which is most threatening, which in the case of politics may or may not be facts. It may or may not be about groups that they are interested in becoming part of. We find in the experiments that we do, and I can take more questions about the kind of methods at whatever point. I spent a long time learning how to scare people about politics and measuring what happens afterward, which it's actually not that hard. I can teach you how to do it too. But when you scare people about politics and they become threatened, we also see in certain policy areas they become more trusting of government, but particular experts in the policy area where that they have become threatened. You may want to think through how does that work in a pandemic, and I can tell you from my more current work that there are some dynamics that have changed over time since this book was published in 2015. The other set of findings is that under conditions of anxiety, when you make people scared about politics, you increase their support for politics that are protective, that might keep them safe from harms, whether or not those harms come from, say, a public health threat, or those harms come from immigration. And the question is, what kinds of political leaders can make you scared about what kinds of issues? And then who are you most likely to listen to that their solutions are in fact protective? So there's a lot of open questions. I think as you're thinking through how this applies to our current politics, we may want to think through what are the other kinds of emotions that are in politics and what are their impacts as well, right? So it's not just anxiety, although there's a lot of that. We have the politics of hope, the politics of enthusiasm, there's politics of anger. We can talk about all of those and the implications for democratic citizenship. But I think my main takeaway is that in a world where a lot of people pay little attention to politics most of the time, that emotion is a way that you can get political engagement. And we want to think about what is the nature of that engagement, and is it always cooperative engagement? Is it always building democratic citizenship? And I'm not convinced that emotion, again, is bad all the time. I think under certain conditions it has less good outcomes when we think about the politics of anger, for example. But a kind of politics without emotion is one that it's hard to imagine everyday citizens being interested in participating in.
Thank you. Our second panelist is Melody McCurtis. Melody McCurtis is the Deputy Director and Lead Organizer of Metcalf Park Community Bridges, a resident-led organization committed to creating a thriving, liberated, and robust Metcalf Park community. McCurtis grew up in Metcalf Park, a hyper-majority Black community on Milwaukee's north side. She's always been committed to working with her neighbors in Metcalf Park to create the community they deserve by dismantling, imagining, creating, and building all simultaneously. By means of organizing, we are grounded in community-led power and creation, understanding that we/us are the experts of what we experience, the dreamers of our desires, and the genius of our liberated future. She prioritizes and is directed by her neighbors' community-led reinvestment plan. She's a queer, single mother and co-parent of 3 beautiful children. Melody's a warrior in her own right, leading from a place of life lessons and experience. She's passionate about worker and housing cooperatives, mutual aid, civic engagement and advocacy, and all things justice for all Black lives.
That was really good. I wonder who wrote that for me. Wow, that was wonderful. Hey everybody, I'm Melody. In summary, I do a lot of amazing things, and I get to do that with people that watch me grow up and people I grew up with. Some of the things that I'm looking forward to with this conversation is talking about trust, right? Talking about another piece that I'm seeing is the lack of understanding when it comes to civic engagement and who's on the ground working with people for them to understand that they actually do have power and that these officials work for us. So I hope we can get into that. I do want to talk about the amazing things that's happening on the ground, some of the things that I'm seeing, and the disconnect. I also want to talk about the fact that people should be getting aware and involved of what's happening and how it impacts their everyday life, especially with our local elections and our local officials. Yeah, so I'm ready to jump into it. I think that's a good summary for me. Yeah.
So for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to be asking our panelists some questions, most of them addressed to both of them, but a few addressed specifically to one or the other. I expect there will be some discussion between them as well in the course of this, and I'm going to encourage you to respond to one another when you think something is particularly interesting. We'll follow that up in the last 20 or so minutes with questions from the audience here and any questions that are coming in over the internet for people who are watching us there. I'll start off by pointing out that we're, in this discussion, I think, going to toggle between different modes of what we think of as political engagement. One that Wisconsin just went through a couple of days ago, and the one that most people default to is thinking about this in terms of voting, going out and casting a ballot. But there are, as any community organizer knows, there's a lot of different kinds of engagements. There could be the building of institutions, there can be protests, There can be collective engagements, and there's also the building of these sort of emotional networks, which I think both of our participants here are going to talk extensively about. So I want to talk first about what you see the relationship between those as doing. I think, is it a good idea to think of politics and democratization in terms of its result in votes? Or do you think of voting and voting behavior as being just one small part of what political engagement and community building is? We'll start off in the same order. So.
Oh, sure. I think voting is one act of democracy. It is certainly not the only act of democracy. It's one that we focus a lot on because it's cyclical, it's easy to count, and there's a lot of energy around it. But we can imagine, and when we think of the way that we as political scientists count participation, conceptualize participation, it goes way beyond voting, right? So it's things like talking about politics, convincing others to vote, or joining a civic organization. And there are a lot of actually non-political groups that have implications for civic and political engagement also, right? So we have a kind of a long line of literature thinking about how joining civic organizations that have nothing to do with politics is actually part of the political process, because it gives people civic skills that they can then take into politics and feel more comfortable that they know how to call a member of Congress, that they know how to go and vote, they know how to write a letter. They have all of those skills that they got through volunteering at a soup kitchen or in their church or in in student groups. All of those kind of civic organizations, pre-political or apolitical groups, actually are potentially part of the political process as well, because they give both connections to others, and they also give these civic skills that make voting and other participatory acts easier. So I think there's a lot of things that go into democracy and democracy building that are voting is only one of those acts. And then, as you talked about, there's other what we may call out of system kinds of acts as well. So protests, whether that's peaceful or not, and there's a whole range of contentious politics pieces that may also be both building democracy. They can also undermine democracy. But we certainly have these kind of out of the electoral politics realm ways of doing politics, like protest.
Yeah, I would agree. Some other things that I would add to that is that voting is just a tool, right? So these elected officials, they have a platform, they say what they're gonna do, some get elected in, some of them don't. The civic engagement piece is really following up with those elected officials that said that they were gonna do all of these promises and really stand on them for them to understand that we elected you in, you said you were gonna do this, what's happening with it, right? I think that even on the local level, if the garbage men aren't picking up our trash and then we find out that half of the city's budget is going to the police, we don't have dollars to support the garbage men to pick up trash, right? So then we follow, what is the issues? What is that stemming from? How do we combat that? Who do we have to reach out to? Do we have to do a postcard campaign to write the elected officials that's over that? Do we need to show up? Do we need to take the garbage and dump it where their neighborhood is nice at, to just do that display of clean it up? We need funds directed to support our basic needs and services, right? So I think it's a million ways to be civically engaged on a smaller level and a micro level. I think right now in this time, it's necessary for folks to understand that they do have some power, and they really have power when they collect that power together. I think that when folks are saying for this past election to vote uninstructed, right? Because we have a demand that's not being met, right? And we want to come up in numbers, and folks did that, right? So there are numerous of ways to be civically engaged inside of this civic engagement system and outside of this system, right? So we have folks that are building alternative power and processes where they're saying, this is the problem, this is gonna be our community created solution, and this is what that process looks like, and this is what we're voting on. So at the end of the day, your life is political, whether you know it or not. And it's multiple ways to get tapped in to figure out how is my life being used against my will, and how do I want my life to be used for the will of me and my people.
Before we turn to the question of building trust, I want to ask a question about the problem that we face, which is a surplus of distrust. I think when we're talking about emotions, we know that we're talking about the intensification of emotions usually. And there's a lot of different mechanisms, some of them personal, some of them in the large-scale media, that are used to transform our emotional states. What are some of the ones that are used to build distrust? And I'm thinking specifically of the ways in which, for example, there's people interested in depressing the vote in, say, our Black communities by getting people to believe that, like, my actions don't matter, my vote doesn't matter. Like, what are the distrust mechanisms that you, in your experience and research, have seen?
You want to go first?
No, I want to hear your answer first.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing, when you first talk to somebody, I'm a Black woman working in the Black community, the first conversation, it might be, our votes don't count, right? The second conversation, you start learning that in school they took out civic engagement. Why is that? In our Black schools, did they take that out, right? Then you start learning, I tried to go vote. Each time I went, they said I had to bring a new thing, except for telling me the first time I went, right? So I don't really think it's distrust, it's the process is so hard to vote that folks are saying, I just don't even want to do it. But if somebody like me is constantly going over and over and over again, that 10th time, they might trust the fact that is my whole block going, I'll go if my whole block is going, right? So creating something that's culturally specific to the conditions of what's happening and what they're experiencing. Being able to like listen to what folks are going through. When I think about my people that have been formerly incarcerated, who are no longer on supervision, being scared to go vote because they think they're gonna go to jail if they go vote, right? And that's a scare tactic that is threaded through our community through that system. So even just having the time and the patience to break some of those barrier downs, it's more than just distrust. It's a process and a lack of understanding that some people can argue and say is by design, right? To make it difficult.
So I think if you look at, and just to kind of see the question a little bit, if you look at the General Social Survey, which is a kind of nationally representative survey that's been in the field since 1972, and they asked, this is mostly sociologists, and they asked things like, trust in various institutions, the presidency, Congress, the news media, corporations, right, religious organizations. The trend over time has been deep decreases in trust in every institution over time, except the military, right? So we do still have some institutions that are seen as trustworthy, that they do what they say that they're going to do. But there is a significant lack of trust in the federal government, the state government. Local governments, people tend to trust more, even if there are lots of barriers to participation. So I think the question is, both why is there this kind of decrease in trust over time? And some of it has to do with the fact that often the federal government has acted in ways that are not very trustworthy, right? I mean, if you think about Watergate and all sorts of large ways that the public trust was broken in very clear ways. And also there's been changes in kind of other systems like media systems that are now there's lots more competition in the media system. So a lot of what the media wants to tell you is, oh, you can't trust this institutional media, you have to trust us because they're looking for market share. And so there's a kind of there's a reason that we have, like, trust is much easier to break than it is to build back up. And so I do think some of the ways to build back trust is, well, that wasn't what you asked, but I'm going to answer thinking about out loud a little bit about how you build back up trust. One is you actually do what you say you're going to do, right? And you make interactions with government more pleasant, right? So if you've had if you had to go do something at a government agency and it was efficient and people were pleasant, that actually is really helpful, because then you can say, oh, government's not all bad. Like, I got my license renewed recently and it was like super efficient, and I was like, oh, look at that. Like, things aren't as bad as one might say. But if we have lots of programs where, like, there's high administrative burdens to do things that are meant to help you, where it's really hard to get your garbage picked up, it's really hard to do all the basic functions of government, you have a lot of people telling you shouldn't trust government because they're trying to, they don't care about you, and then the actual functionings of government aren't bad. These are two bad combinations. But if you can see interactions where government is in fact working and there's some clear connection to government spending or whoever is, right? Like, when the federal government builds new highways, they should slap their name all over it so that people understand this is actual government functioning in action. And there's a reason when your governor, signs in law that you get a tax rebate, that you get, it would be actually much easier and cheaper to just send you money in the mail, to just put it direct deposit. But instead they send you, at least in New York State, they send me a check and it's signed by my governor. Why is it signed by my governor? Because she wants to claim credit for it. It would be much cheaper for them just to direct deposit, but they want to send me a check that has my governor's name on it, because they're saying, hey, government works, you get money back from us. And look, we're trustworthy, right? So there's lots of, I think, different things that government can do, most basic, just like actually functioning, and then also credit claiming to help, create more trust in the process.
Thank you. We generally ask questions when we talk about trust. We ask in whom, like, who do we trust? One of the things I noticed in both of your work is you're also interested in the question of with whom do we trust? That there's a social dynamic to the people alongside of us who are helping us negotiate the world and think about, like, where do we go? What do we do? Who is worthy of our attention, energy, and trust? So could you each in turn talk a little bit about how you see that getting built? What are the dynamics by which that social dimension of trust gets created?
Oh, I'm not sure I have a great answer. You go first and let me think.
Okay, reset.
How do we trust with people, right? It's not just an individual decision. Well, am I going to do this? We learn from the stuff we read, from our friends, from our conversations, what kind of trust is worth, what kinds of people and institutions are worth trusting. So can you talk a little bit about how that gets built? How do we work with others in terms of building trust?
Oh, this is deep.
And I would think that would come to the very core of what community organizing is, right?
So again, I'm a Black woman working in a Black community. Milwaukee's majority Black and brown. Government has never really had us on the agenda, right? So how I answer this question is, we have to be building communities that say, these are the things we need, and the folks that's in control of these things, this is what we deserve, this is what needs to happen. And if those folks aren't doing what they're supposed to do, they need to exit, right? So I think that what I'm seeing in Milwaukee, which is a beautiful thing, is that Milwaukee is building some interconnected trust with one another to really build the power to change some things up, right? More folks are running that are directly impacted, folks who have some experience with the conditions on the ground and really went through a civic process to learn what is the inner workings, what can I do if I get into this seat or not, right? I also think that in Black communities, we rarely ever start with a cool process or a welcoming process, right? Usually we have to do a lot of fighting first, and I love a good fight. I can fight the best of them, and once we get past the fight, we're good. I'm thinking about one of our elected officials was making a decision for our community, and when we caught wind, we had a big fight. And this official was like, I'm doing this for y'all. Who did you ask? You did it for you, right? And our voting turnout increased that following year. And we couldn't get rid of this elected official. He was at the doors. He was like, what do y'all need me to do? Because he didn't think that we were valued enough, right? Because we weren't voting, right? But my community made civic engagement one of their priorities behind that, because they said, if we vote and hold this person accountable, he's gonna do what we're saying needs to be done. Not what his agenda is, not what folks that are donating to his campaign is doing, what the community is demanding. Because you work for us, because we took time out of our day to go and cast a vote, right? And we're taking time out of our day to follow up with you and help you do your job better by giving you the plan that you need to be executing. So I think this needs to be replicated, nationally. We have to build the trust amongst each other. We have to take our democracy back. What I'm seeing is folks are in these positions making decisions on behalf of people that they're not even thinking about, right? And we have to flip that. It has to come back to the people, that we're making collective decisions that impacts us all in our full humanity. So that's how to get the trust back. We either got to take it back, we got to retrain them on how to do their job with us in mind, co-creating what we need on the local, state, and federal level. I think I answered the question.
So I'm going to come at this a slightly different angle and thinking about who we trust in kind of from my empirical work, right? So we made our respondents anxious about a different policy areas. So we made them anxious about smallpox. I always say, we did these experiments, we didn't give anyone smallpox, but we did have them read about a fictional smallpox outbreak in one place and not in another, and compared their attitudes. And what we found was, if you make people, again, pre-COVID, anxious about an infectious disease outbreak, who they trust is medical experts, and particularly people who had a background in infectious disease. So what that tells us is that when people are uncertain, anxious about a policy area, that they want information, and they want accurate information, and the heuristic that they use for getting that accurate information is turning to someone who has some sort of expertise. Now, that expertise doesn't actually have to necessarily come from a degree. It could come from life experience. It could come from a kind of shared group identity. But people are looking for, particularly under conditions of uncertainty, they're looking for the best information so that they can make a decision. And they put their trust in people who are telling them that they have the best information that can help them stay protected. Now, I think we can also think about how this gets kind of turned on its head, which is, as we saw during the pandemic, that there is a kind of role of undercutting expertise, that also we have a kind of an undercurrent of people who don't believe in expertise or who want to undercut it, who would say that, everyone has equal knowledge and you should go with your kind of gut around vaccines or masking or whatnot. And so I do think the social trust is important because it can kind of lead us to accurate information. It also can lead us to sometimes discount the kind of factual information under conditions of threat.
Can I add to that really quick? Because this is very, the social trust piece, just to bring the like pandemic into the room. I remember when the pandemic hit Milwaukee, all of the stores closed, all of the gas station closed, the schools closed. We didn't close, right? What we first did a survey like what's happening in our community. Do y'all even know about COVID? What do you need, right? And we got folks to complete that survey. One of the things that they said is that we don't know what COVID is. When we turn on the news, it's not in our language, so we don't understand, right? Our health department was not being active in making sure my community and communities like Metcalf Park, it was not proactive in helping them understand in the language that they would understand. Instead, when they turned on the news, all they saw was, if you leave the house without a mask, you're going to jail. And a study came out that when that was implemented, Black and brown folks were arrested for not having a mask on and they got ticketed. So that is how our government responded. That is how our health department responded. Instead, we made care packages, taking them door to door. We talked to different health providers. We got the information. We co-created resource guides to break down what COVID was, how to stay safe, different things like that. We did the work that was necessary in that time of need because we knew socially, Facebook had all of these lies on there. Social media had all these lies on there. When our people turned on the news, it's ugly things about Black people on the news, so our folks aren't even watching it. Young people ain't. Why would I turn that on if I'm seeing something negative about my community every time I turn it on, or something that's not in my language? So there is multiple levels of expertise, and one thing can't be it. All things have to work together to get to the hearts and minds of folks and get to folks in need during something as devastated as the pandemic. So again, elected officials could have said, hey, what's happening on the ground? Instead, they said, we're gonna ticket folks. We're gonna take them to jail and put them at even a bigger risk. When the elections happened, Milwaukee went down to 5 polling locations out of 150 of them. They said, y'all still gotta go vote? I've requested a mail-in ballot 2 weeks in advance. It never came, so I had to get out there and be at risk of getting COVID. This is how folks were responding. And the only people that was on the ground responding to the needs and the conditions of the people was the people, right? So we do have expertise. If we're able to get it together and do it with no resources, they have the resources. They could pick up the phone and say, this ain't my expertise. What do we need to do? How can we help? So all of these expertise needs to come together. When laws are being passed, they need to be talking to folks on the ground, because your law can get passed and impact my family directly, and it could be a hit or miss. So I just wanted to lift that up.
Thanks. That leads to a question I can direct to Professor Gadarian. It seems to me that within a number of institutions, there has historically been an assumption that the way the people in those institutions think is the way that everybody thinks. I noticed that political psychology is not part of, say, our public health infrastructure. And so there was an assumption early on in the COVID pandemic that if we say this is what you should do, everybody's going to turn around and do that, because of course they don't want to die, and so they'll just follow it. And it was never even stated that way. It was just kind of this presumption that operated in a sense of, we're the experts, you must trust us, and we don't even have to do any work, to go back to Melody's example, as to like, how do we connect to a community? How do we speak a different kind of language? So could you talk a little bit about what it is that leads institutions and experts to misunderstand what the political dynamics of trust are, and how that affects the people who they think should be listening to them?
Sure, that's a big, really good question, and it relates to some work that I'm doing right now. I think the idea that Well, I think if you look around faculty meetings, for instance, we have a similar kind of thing. That it's hard to remember not knowing something, right? So first of all, I think when you get to a certain level of you're surrounded by other people with the same profession, the same educational background, you have a sense that everybody has this shared knowledge, and that must also be the case that everyone else in the world understands this, forgetting that you have a very niche set of understandings of the world that comes from not just your educational background, but your lived experience as well. So in trying to explain that the world is quite different for people with different resources, different media literacy, who also may not be trusting of the public health system in the first place for very good reasons, that they're just telling people to do things does not actually mean that they both will accept that or even receive that information, because maybe they're not even paying attention to the sources where you're putting it out. So I think part of this is that in professional networks, we forget what it's like not to know and not to see the world in the same way. I think there's a homogeneity in terms of lived experience and background in a lot of professions, particularly in public health. And so some of the work that I've been doing recently has been making a claim. So one of the things that my co-authors and I did in our most recent book on the pandemic was trace out the many ways in which partisanship came in very early in the pandemic and shaped the way both government responded, but also people in the mass public responded. And so why is it where we see different levels of vaccination among Republicans and Democrats, and thinking about those dynamics? One of the things at the end of the book we say is that social scientists should be in the room when these decisions are being made. And, I mean, it's a little bit self-serving and a little bit just saying that, in fact, if you had asked political communications folks and people who work in political psychology early on, if just the kinds of messagings that were coming out about masking and vaccination, if they were going to be effective, they could have talked about all of the different ways that they were going to be ineffective and think about much better micro-targeting, thinking about using who are the trusted leaders in communities, thinking about them as kind of vectors of information. So in the fall, I put together a very large National Science Foundation grant proposal with a group of epidemiologists that would fund a project that would, in modeling of diseases like COVID and other pandemic diseases, integrate social and behavioral data into those models, because the epidemiological models about where COVID was going to go and where the outbreaks were going to be really bad did not take into account things like trust in government or people's skepticism of doctors or the healthcare system. And so there were at best guesses based on the diseases themselves, but not the social part of it. So that was a long answer. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be done there in terms of social scientists and humanists and people in the sciences talking to each other more, and probably having, a lot of medical schools have community members as part of their bioethics committees as well, right? So in thinking about bringing in the community into these conversations as well.
Would you like to talk a little bit about what Black and brown communities in Milwaukee feel like when institutions come in that sort of condescending, you should see the world the way that I see it mode, and what the effects and consequences of that can be?
Y'all trying to get deep. I think what we see, it's really a question. What is the value, right? I think about the pandemic a lot because we still in it, right? We're still dealing with a lot of the consequences of the pandemic. A lot of the thing that I hated the most seeing is this is our new normal. But for Black and brown folks in Milwaukee, this was our normal. Y'all just seeing it, right? So every time seeing that was a blow, right? when these decisions are being made, right? If a group of folks have one skill set and they say, we're gonna give blue watermelons because we figured out it's blue watermelons, but when you come over here and they're saying we need orange and green and yellow watermelons, and then it's this clash. So I think that folks with different skill sets have to be willing to ask, what is the value of asking folks? What are the needs, right? What are the challenges? And then not only asking, getting consent, right? And you can do that. So I work on various things. We build houses and parks and all of this. I work with elected officials. I work with medical folks. And we had to organize them and kind of train them to work in community, not over community, not to community. And you have to kind of like come in like you're earning a value being at the table with the folks that you are making plans for. It is a value in that, right? It's some humanity in that because often our community is looked at as a project, right? Or something to assess, right? Nothing to grow with and into. So it's really a value question. How can we build trust if you don't value the people here? And that's what we're seeing. And everything we have to fight against. I was at a community meeting last night that went over to about 10 p.m. around rezoning. And the city didn't think that the community was able to digest this plan that they're slapping together and what the harm that it could do. And they were taken back by that. But now you need to put it on hold and take it back so we can get this right. Otherwise, you're gonna have 300 people when you're trying to pass this thing down there, right? So it's really a value, a humanizing of all people and all expertise, right? I don't know how to build parks, but I work with urban planners that could utilize my expertise and saying, hey, I don't want a swing right here by a thorn bush where a kid could fly into. Because you got people that will really draw up a park like that. So these little bitty things, you have to be there to make those connections and be willing to work with each other and value each other in your skill set. Yeah.
I know this is not really either of your particular area of expertise, but I do want to ask about the way in which we seek out and find information and the transformations in media and what it is that we trust. Because I think our models are often like, well, you know, the New York Times talks to the experts and then that's published. But that's not the way the 6 o'clock news operates, and that's certainly not the way that typing a question into Google operates, and it's not the way that looking at TikTok to try and figure out how to, you know, deal with a medical issue operates. So, like, what are the generational and media effects of the way in which we try and find out things? How are those changing us?
That's a big question.
These are all big questions.
They're all, but yeah. So, I mean, the first big transformation in terms of thinking about media systems was going from kind of broadcast news, where there was a kind of very constrained, very formulaic kind of 6 o'clock news. There was nothing else on. Everybody gets a little bit of politics at night, whether they want to or not, if you're watching news, to kind of a cable news and internet kind of area where you get to a lot more choice. If you want to watch news, if you want to watch TV, you don't have to watch the news at 6 o'clock. You can watch almost anything else that's on TV. The kind of the change over time where we've gone from a lot of local newspapers to very few local newspapers, and a lot of those local newspapers are now getting their stories from AP and national stories, and so you get a kind of a lack of local potential accountability because there's not a lot of local news left in ways that there used to be. So I think all of those big changes, and then you kind of put the kind of TikTok social media on top of it, means that the people who are really interested in news have lots and lots of ways to get news, and they're very, very knowledgeable. And there also are people who have they have a lot of political knowledge. They also are strong partisans, and they are kind of very able, and they're also like they're still trusting, right? Because they're still like engaging with mainstream media. And then you have young people who are much less likely to be consuming mainstream media. They have lots of digital sources, some of which are reasonable and some of which are really more like a social connection. A lot of TikTok some of it is informational, and some of it is really kind of like social connections that people are making. And so I don't know that I think that's always that the lack of trust is coming from the big media changes, but it certainly is. There's more media outlets that are portraying that they have some sort of information and expertise that people should kind of listen to. And so you have a lot more choice now. And so it's a lot less clear for many people about what is trustworthy information versus not. But I would just keep in mind that while we do have all of these digital sources and they're more popular among young people, broadcast news and local news are still the majority of news that people take in. They have millions of people. Your local news has millions of people who watch it every night. So they are a potential real source of information. Now, they also are competitive with each other, and there's been a lot of conglomeration of those over time. You learn a lot about your local murder rates on your local news at night. But it is a potential for people to learn and trust politics through that kind of broadcast news, because it is still the most popular source, even though we have all these digital options as well.
Yeah, I would agree. You have way more access to a whole bunch of stuff, whether it's true or not, whether it's accurate or not, whether it's a scientific experiment or learning like weird things. It's all out there. It's accessible, which could be powerful, right, to get the word out about things. And it also could be used to misinform folks, right? So I'm seeing a lot of that. Yeah, I'm just seeing a lot of it.
My own personal last question for both of you is my most personal. I'm somebody who studies and works in political philosophy, and the tradition in that is, people asking questions of like, where does authority come from, or how do we maximize the good for society? And one of the critical perspectives on that, critical of that tradition, but also I think critical in important, has been a shift, especially led within political philosophy by Black feminists, saying, let's center love and care and the future in the kinds of things that we value, instead of looking for an abstraction that people are not connected to. Let's look at those abstractions which actually motivate us to, whether it's take care of companion animals or raise children or build our communities. Like, there's where the real important philosophical and conceptual motivations come from. So for each of you in your experience, like, where have you found that for me is like the transformation of my world in many ways. Where have you found those kinds of transformations, or those inspirations, or those things that make you optimistic that a kind of collective trust building is possible?
So I say that my next project is going to be on like the politics of ice cream and islands, because I only study like threat and terrorism, and but I do think that what makes me optimistic is that there is a lot of work now being done on empathy and the ways that empathy can overcome and bump up against some of our and empathy, not just for one's own group, but for other groups as well, can be a source of kind of collective action and bumping up against the threats to democracy that come from groups that try and kind of tear people apart. And so that I think that work, it's not my own, but the work that I see being done in the field and thinking about the ways that empathy, listening, and the ways that groups can start to work together through that kind of collective empathy makes me optimistic that this kind of grand experiment of democracy is teetering, but is not kind of over the edge.
Yeah, that was a beautiful ending question. Yeah, so I think every day I am the embodiment of love, joy, and what life needs to look like, right? So I have 3 children. I don't want them having to do the same work I'm doing when they get older. They should be able to live full, whole, beautiful lives where they care for not only themselves, but each other and other folks. They have the basic things that they need to not just survive, but to thrive. And I think like all the work that I'm doing is small seeds to making that possible here in Milwaukee and nationally. So I think like just showing up every day, fighting the good fight, doing the love work, because I'm doing a lot of love work too, listening to my folks, really rolling up the sleeves with my folks and folks who believe that we all should be liberated, right? We all should be free. We all should have what we need. That's what really it's about, right? We really need to look at each other through love to get the things done. So yeah, I get to do that every day.
Thank you. Before I turn to questions from the audience, both those present and digitally, I want to know if there's questions or reactions that each of you have for one another that you'd like to raise or ask or just mention.
I think so. I'm interested in hearing your responses to what the audience asked.
Do we have any questions in the room? Or please, if you're listening to this or watching this online, if you could write your questions in the chat and those can get handed to me. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I had a question regarding language from government. I mean, in particular, just to provide some context, we had a referendum that was up on our ballot. We had a couple, you know, and there were 2 that came from the state that could have been a little bit difficult to understand. So what role would that play when we're giving out language, particularly on the ballot? How does that affect trust in our government? And yeah, just how does it affect trust in our government?
Yeah, so if anyone has ever voted on a referendum, you've probably read it several times and been like, I have no idea what this is supposed to mean, right? And it is written that way on purpose, generally, so that the sponsors of the referendum are not quite as obvious, and some of it has to be written in a technical way. So the political science literature on this suggests that rather than the plain language of the referendum, because they're often hard to understand, people use shortcuts to try and figure out whether or not they're for or against this and what should be the support. And so they use groups that come out for and against as ways to decide, should I vote for this? Now, sometimes League of Women Voters or other groups will give you the plain language of it. They probably shouldn't have to do that. You should probably be able to see what the plain language is, but some civic groups will do that work for you. But there's a kind of, I say famous, right? It's political science, so it's not that famous. But there's a piece by Skip Lupia from the early 90s about California has a lot of referendum. And so he found out that through a series of studies that he did that there was a very complex insurance regulation kind of referendum on the ballot, and how could everyday Californians understand whether they should support this or not? Well, once they found out that the kind of car insurance organizations were for it, people decided that they were against it, right? So one of the ways, so I do think this matters for trust, because it looks like government is trying to hide things from you when they're kind of using this very convoluted language. But one of the shortcuts that everyday citizens can use is both to use the kind of plain language that civic organizations will put together, but also figure out which groups are for and against this. And that will help you align your values and what you think of as important to knowing whether or not you should support it or not.
Ditto. All the things. It's very confusing. They always are. We often have to like break down what things mean. League of Women Voters does a great job of breaking down referendums all the time. So you have like a starting point. But I would see like who's supporting what, talking to your base, hearing what's on the ground, so you know like what your base is for and what they're not for. But yeah, it's intended for folks to do more work on the ground.
We have a question from online. What is the best way to encourage people to lead their communities to take action, as with Metcalf Park, especially when they have lost trust?
Oh, that's deep, because who did they lose trust in? That's number one. But if you're inspired to change some things, invite folks to come to the table with you, whether that's to share a meal or just to talk about like what is the concerns, right? Get a consensus. Is everybody feeling the same thing? Reach out to Melody at Metcalf Park Community Bridges so I can understand like what is the things that's happening, what you need support with. And then map out what's the issues, what is some of the solutions that you and your neighbors are thinking would fix the problem, and then who's in charge of making it happen. So just reach out. That's all I'm gonna say.
Okay, I'm going to try this question, but even my own notes are very confused. I work on voter outreach in the city of Milwaukee, and one of the things that I have to deal with is assumptions that one community makes about another community. I think Melody knows what I'm talking about. For one thing, because we're a swing state, we get a lot of people swooping in. I call them the swoopers. And,
yes.
I will say, what do you think is voter registration and voter turnout on the north side of Milwaukee? Oh, I don't know, 20%. They don't know the turf. They don't know it's 80%. And the reason it's not higher is because of throwing everybody into jail. I'm really glad you brought that up as a voter suppression issue, because it is. So I guess my question is, the challenge of marginalized communities in just sort of communicating their own needs, not just within their community, but outside the community. So just as one example, you were talking about anxiety issues. Well, for people with lots of economic resources, it's housing values, because they own houses. People who live in certain areas of Milwaukee, as you mentioned, the concern is, am I going to get arrested and go to jail? So bridging that particular, we've talked a lot about distrust of institutions, but intercommunity, it's not even distrust, it's just cluelessness, I guess.
Yep, it's lack of understanding.
I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, so it's the lack of understanding. Like we're not talking to each other, right? We need to create opportunities to talk to each other. So folks are worried about the housing values going up. With this new referendum, the NPS referendum, there was a lot of folks on the fence about that, right? If the taxes are increased, we have landlords sending folks letters saying, hey, I'm gonna go up on your rent, even though they just went up $100, $300 a week ago, right? So we have so many similarities and kind of the same issues, but we don't talk. We don't even see each other enough to even want to have those conversations. We do a lot of work with a lot of folks who I would task with this, though, who's really good at bringing folks together from all backgrounds, all places, is Emilio at Milwaukee Turners. You know, maybe just saying, hey, let's chop it up at the Turners. Let's talk about the hard things. What's the disconnects? Because we need all of us to get some things changed, right? And we would find out that we're more alike than we think. We have some of the same issues.
I think this is also online, I think directed to both of you, but we'll start with Professor Gadarian. How can people from different communities, locations, and lived experiences work together to learn about one another and build trust?
I earlier talked about some non-political kinds of groups that I actually do a good job of putting people in contact with each other. So I think it doesn't always have to be around politics. And I think one of the things that, like, for people who are turned off about politics, actually having civic organizations that arts groups, museums groups, bowling leagues, all of the things, right? Bob Putnam's loves bowling leagues, for those of you who have read Bowling Alone, about social capital. But there are lots of ways to build community connections that don't actually have to center around politics. Food systems or farmers markets or lots of places where people can come together around a shared interest, I think are ways that then do actually benefit politics because they make connections for people. And the connections and the collaboration, even as you disagree, are a fundamental part of politics, right? So this is how, when I teach Intro to American Politics, we talk about the core of the class is about collective action, and the collective action is about working together even as you disagree. And I think that's where making these connections prior to having a political discussion actually is super helpful, because you see the humanity in people, you see their shared interests. Yeah, you both love gardening, bird watching, whatever it is. It actually does benefit politics because it seeds those conversations in ways that aren't about wins and losses either. They're about potentially working together on a project.
That's right. And I would agree with that. Creating a space. So every month we do joy dinners where community members, folks all over Milwaukee can come to, and we just talk, we share a meal, we talk about the amazing things that happen throughout the month and what's to come, right? So that's one way to plug in, just to get to know folks on the north side, you know, in Metcalf Park and the surrounding neighborhoods. We also have, you know, volunteer opportunities. So we built the phase 1 and phase 2 of the park. We had over 150 volunteers from all over Milwaukee and Wisconsin come to that, right? You can engage with like community canvas days. We might be canvassing about a healthcare system that left the community, right? And healthcare is essentially important to all folks. So we just had a healthcare summit. We had 150 people there, and it was very multiracial, right? There was folks from all over Milwaukee and all throughout Wisconsin that came because they said folks should have access to healthcare services. So it's all about who you know, seeking, right? If you're seeking to build, you know, cross community, right? Seek it, right? Put a call out on Facebook. Somebody will connect you. We have to be connecting folks, right? And having those like entry points.
So I just want to finger on this for 1 second, which is you talked about yourself as a bridge before. I actually think that that's the other piece of this, is not just separate groups, is actually people who are doing the kind of, forgive the term, but like you're a little bit like a yenta, you're a matchmaker, right? So like you're a bridge. And so you need people like that in the community because it could just be separate communities, but you need the people to also do the kind of matchmaking and the bridge making. And there's actually a science about this in kind of the work on organizational psychology, is that you can build something and you can get a lot of people interested in it, but if you don't have the matchmaker piece of it, then the kind of collaborations don't happen.
Yeah. And people come because they care, but they stay because they have something to do. They know what you're building, right? So that's the kind of containers that you want to create. You want folks to show up because they care or they're interested, but you want them to stay because this is something that they love to do. And that might mean I'd love to have conversations with somebody on 6th Street, and I live on 66th Street, right, every month. So I'm just going to show up for that, right? So create those containers, be those connectors, and build those bridges.
Please.
I live in the land of old people. And by that I mean those of us who are over 80. And our population is growing exponentially every year. This would be addressed to both of you. Do you feel it's necessary to call upon the experience of those of us who are older and have lived our lives and may not be familiar with how to operate, pick up Spotify and TikTok and et cetera, et cetera? I would address this to both of you. Do you concern or do you feel there's a concern to engage the older people into the various subjects that we're talking about here today?
Sure. I mean, I think when we talk about voter turnout, older voters are most engaged, most likely to turn out, most listened to by government, give the most money to candidates. So there is a definite kind of importance to that generation, and then thinking about how to engage them into the process and kind of in technological changes that is absolutely a big part of it. So one of the things that we're planning at Syracuse about the election of 2024 is to have a discussion about aging and voting. We're going to call it like gerontocracy, the gerontocracy election, because there's so much discussion in a very ageist fashion about our two major party candidates for president. And we're going to actually talk to our colleagues in aging studies and neuroscience about what do we learn when we age? What are the things that we should we be concerned about cognitive decline? How do young people vote versus older people vote? I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on with age and aging that we should start thinking about and talking about in politics.
Yeah, so we do generational organizing and community building. I could think back to, there's an 85-unit senior building in Metcalf Park. Back in 2018, it was really hard to get in this building. They were having these community meetings. So I ended up meeting one of the seniors that kind of snuck me into the building. And I was like, yes, I got into the meeting. And out of that 85 unit, only 5 people was actually voting. They said, we don't know who's running, who's on the ballot, what their platform is. So as a result, we actually had a forum inside of the senior building, and all 80 of those folks voted, right? We need the wisdom of our elders to let us know if we're way off or if folks tried to do that before and it didn't work, and this is why, right? We need to be talking to each other. Young people need our elders. We need that guidance. We just went through 4 years of isolation, and a lot of us are in our phones, right? And we're missing that physical connection. So we're doing a lot of art, joy, and culture convenings. We're actually working on creating a community archive, right? So really, how are we getting all generations in the room, sharing what they know and building with each other to build the community that we want? You're a part of our community, so we need you.
For the last question, this one also comes from online. The question is there a way to organize an issue that is not a problem? And I take it that they mean do we have to wait for things to be a crisis, or can we act toward more positive ends? How do you turn out people to support a matter or issue like that?
I think you can absolutely, I mean, a lot of agendas are set by people in the grassroots who identify issues before they become problems. Now, it may be if people, in the parties haven't recognized the benefit of taking a stance on one of those issues, that it will take repeated cycles to get your issue on the agenda. So I think the important piece, if you are starting to organize around an issue that is not already on the agenda, is patience, but also keep going, right? It may be several election cycles before your issue becomes taken up on a platform or dealt with or voted on. But that doesn't mean that you have to wait until someone else has identified an issue for it to become something that you organize around.
Yeah, I agree. We don't always have to be reactive. We can be proactive. If you see that something is coming down the pipeline, this is the best time to engage folks around it and start talking about those things and organizing and make a vision of what you see happening as a result, right? So always be proactive. So if you have to react, you're ready.
Okay.
Thank you. And I want to just make a comment and then a question. The comment is, I'm just realizing I'll just make a plug for the flow of the 3 years of programming that we did, which was, the first one was Lonely No More, looking at isolation and also the mechanics of isolation and the weaponization of isolation. And then Nourishing Trust, which was about using food to really bring people together. And then how that all relates to civic participation. And I'm seeing the weaponization of isolation and the perception of connectivity through social media and various ways where isolation is weaponized with shame around loneliness as an emotion that makes people retreat or become more hostile if they're inflamed by the feelings of isolation and loneliness. So to even frame that and understand that as a weaponization makes the connectivity that you're talking about even more important. So my question is 2 parts. One is, I feel like going back to what I learned from this is, can trust be scaled? And if that feeling of mutual recognition and mutual value is there, it feels like it can, but I would just love to hear both of you just comment on whether at the end of the day you think trust can be scaled. And then also sort of looping back to the last roundtable, what can universities do if actually a precondition for democracy is empathy? What is the role, what unique contribution can universities make? That's a lot, sorry.
Okay. I think trust has to be scaled, right? I think fundamentally in a large democracy, no institution works, no system where you have to vote without any specific benefit that you get does not work unless you trust both the system that you're going to get an outcome that's fair, even if you disagree with it, and that the institutions are going to function at least nominally. So I don't think that we have a choice. Trust has to be scaled. I think it can be scaled. I think empathy is a mechanism where we can think about how to scale it. And in terms of what universities can do, I think having forums like this where people talk to each other who might not, we hadn't met before. I learned a lot. I learned about your community, but also about thinking about how the work that I do may not travel to all communities, I would want to think about, how our theories of government meet the actual practice of governance. But I also think the classrooms are very special places where students can learn to listen and actually hear each other, because just talking at each other is not the way we build empathy. actual learning comes from both the content that we're teaching, but also the listening part to each other, which we don't have incentives to do in many other parts of society.
That's right. I would agree. It can be scaled. I will also say that trust is a practice, and every day you have to work to build that trust and maintain that trust. And practice does not make perfect, it makes memory. So how are we building trust as a memory in our bodies and with each other? I think that it's beautiful that you all are putting something like this together that students have access to. When you do this again, I would want to see a panel of students that attended these and hear what they learned from it and what they're taking away from it and how they're modeling what they learned in their everyday life and as they're building community in this campus and beyond. So I think that y'all are doing, this is some amazing work that y'all are doing, and being able to put folks all across different spectrums, different expertise in a room where they have real access to grab some of those nuggets.
Thank you. I'm going to close things out by asking Emilio to come back up.
This was such a fantastic and poignant and touching panel. I just felt, while you were talking about hope and ways for us to increase empathy and communication and elevate our communities, it was very inspiring. Before we leave, we just have a couple of quick announcements. In addition to now knowing the answer to the riddle, what happens when a community organizer and a political scientist enter the room? And as thank you, I owe the three of you, and I have learned Governor Tommy Thompson, I owe you all banana pudding. So April 24th is the Milwaukee Turners annual meeting at Turner Hall from 5 to 8 p.m. We invite you all to come there, come see old friends, elect new board members, and dance to some great DJs. That's my only one announcement. Last time I think I had 7 announcements. You get one today. Once again, and importantly, I'd really love to thank our fantastic panelists here. Also, in addition to our guests, our production team, Cheston Van Huss, Gabby, Connie, the entire team from UWM that helped to put this together, all the folks that have made this so relatively seamless watching us in internet land, and all of you that have supported this forum, specifically our partners here at the University of Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee Center for 21st Century Studies, and our friends from the Milwaukee County Office of Equity, MICA, NLG Milwaukee, and the Hertzfeld Foundation. If any of you are interested in supporting the Milwaukee Turners and our work or becoming a sponsor, you can visit us online. I hope to see all of you at 6 p.m. tonight for the Pay What You Want yoga. We also offer free yoga for older adults, 50 and older. That counts as me now. On Thursdays too, so feel free to come by. Until next time, please take care of one another. Have a good one.